and welcome to today's Payments Journal webinar, The Evolution of Cross-Border Payments. My name is Rima Katz. I'm the Editor-in-Chief at Payments Journal. And today I'm joined by Hal Ramakers, SVP of Global Solutions at Brightwell, and Brian Riley, Director of Credit and Co-Head of Payments at Javelin Strategy and Research. From mailing checks to the advent of digital all the way to the recent introduction of real-time payments, they're going to talk about the progression of cross-border payments, but also highlight which entities are being left out of these transactions. And they're going to discuss opportunities for them to participate. A few housekeeping items before we begin our discussion. Questions may be submitted anytime through the GoToWebinar portal, or you can also reply to any of the registration or reminder emails sent by GoToWebinar, and our team will get back to you ASAP. The video presentation from today's discussion will be shared by email following today's conversation. To start us off, how have you seen cross-border payments evolve over time?
Yeah, that's been definitely a big fundamental change in cross-border payments, as with everything else in the world. As we look back 20, 30 years, right, money really moved in the form of, of wires. You also had checks. And then, of course, you still had your retail cash providers, right? Your big providers for consumers, the Western Unions and the MoneyGrams. And, that's how money moved around the world. And quite frankly, in a lot of cases, it moved very slowly, very complex, outdated systems. And then over time, things got a little bit better as we got into the internet revolution. And now we started to see what I would say a little bit of a shift between the consumer side and corporate payment side, in the fact that the consumer side made more of a shift now to digital. All of a sudden, you started seeing some third-party remittance companies show up on the world. You start to see third-party providers come into play. And then on the corporate side, though, we still very much stayed in the world of checks and then wires, still working in that process. What's interesting is as we look at that time, one thing that's important to note is that, banks were very heavily involved in remittances early on and in corporate disbursements. And today, on the remittance side, banks really haven't intermediated out of that process. It's moved to these third-party providers and other ways of moving money. On the corporate side, right, we see still using checks. We still see wires, very outdated systems.
Hal, it's just a level set on cross-border payments itself. What's fascinating about it is that there's really different categories. It's just not me shopping in Toronto with a US card, right? It involves people who have relationships with their family and they can support them in any country. That's a type of cross-border payment. It could be me in London shopping at Harrods with a US card is another example. Or it could be a large industrial company moving money across the border to pay for manufacturing. So there's a whole spectrum of what we mean with cross-border payments, right? It's just not the normal transaction that happens within your domestic market. It's crossing jurisdictions and borders that makes a difference. And with that requires the ability to shepherd that money to ensure that it's irrefutable on the transaction side, to protect it from bad guys that look to attack the system, and really to make it an effective and efficient process for people who use it.
Brian, that's a great point that you make, because the world has significantly changed, whether you're doing business or whether you're a consumer. The reality is people have moved cross borders, right? We see more migrants moving into the United States every year. The population keeps increasing. And with that comes the need to send money back home to support their families. So the demand for those types of payments has increased significantly. Same thing in the business world, right? You now have global contractors that are being used by businesses to support their models. And with that comes the need to pay those contractors. Travel has increased. So now you have a lot more global travelers, a lot more global businesses where there's needs to do refunds to passengers. The demand for cross-border payments has increased significantly over the last 20, 30 years as the world has just changed and become much more globalized.
And Brightwell's changed a lot too. When I look at the corporate history, and I think that's something that's really a compelling part of this story. You start as a prepaid company in Chicago in the first decade of the century, right? And you move down to Atlanta and get into the business of delivering payments for the cruise industry. And that's a really complicated niche, right? There's a variation from where the flagship can be licensed, all kinds of employees from different countries across the world. So a very complex ecosystem. And then, of course, you have COVID coming in, and that certainly impacted that industry. And that gave you time to really retool in a lot of ways. And the story is that that's one of the areas where ready payments came into play.
Yeah, that really is our background. 10, 12 years ago, we when we acquired the company, we saw this opportunity, this need in the cruise line space, right? The cruise lines, most people have been on aboard a ship, and you'll notice that the workers on there, they're from all around the world. In reality, probably 95% plus of the people come from over 120, 130 different countries all around the world. And we had to learn the cross-border space because of the needs of our end users. Our end users, the users of our platform, really drove us to come up with the best solutions and learn the cross-border space. And there is a lot of complexity that comes in that space. And over 10 years, we built integrations into 6 different providers, and implemented cash payout rails. We implemented bank account rails. Now we're implementing card rails. But yes, we focused and we learned the cross-border space hands-on, and now we move billions of dollars cross-border in doing that. And so we've learned the space by being in the space. So I think you brought up a really good point a couple of minutes ago, Brian, is there are a lot of different types of transactions and use cases as you look at the cross-border space. And, as we look at the data, it's interesting because the P2P space is a very small percentage of the dollars that are actually moved globally, with about 2% of that volume. The biggest opportunity, right, sits in the B2B space, right? And that's where we're talking about that untapped market where we're still seeing so many checks being issued and so many wires still being done in the old-fashioned way. But what's interesting is, one thing that's not visible here in the volume slide is, a point that you had made in our previous discussions that, you could almost invert this slide completely if you look at the transactions. And that's a very interesting use case as well. So a lot of our focus has been on that P2P space, and now in the the B2C space. And and there's a lot of volume activity, and there's a need to have much faster and much more efficient payments just by the sheer volume of the transactions that are sent that way. But I think you can clearly see that there is a huge opportunity still coming in the next 5 years. The question really is going to come down to who is going to be providing those services, right? Today, those services, again, previously have been provided by the banks. The banks have been disintermediated in a lot of ways. They're still in the large corporate transactions, but for consumer transactions, those have really moved on to other third-party providers and digital companies. We're starting to see some movement now in the B2C space for different use cases, especially with push to debit, but definitely some big changes here in the space.
Sure, Hal. When you drill this down, just going to that metaphor about how these numbers change, think of an isosceles triangle with the point up versus point down. And you have the difference between high value, low volume payments. Those are the corporate payments. And you can see the number on that 85% of the dollar volume. Then on the other side of the coin, you think of consumer payments. Well, those are low value, high volume. So they create 2 different worlds and layers of complexity. There's some common themes that have to go through that nonetheless. So for instance, you need a transaction to be irrefutable. But there's a known sender, there's a known receiver, and there's no gray in between it. That's the irrefutability part that's essential for payments. Things that go beyond that are very different. That's fraud management, but it's that irrefutability that's important. Speed and efficiency is another layer that goes through on both sectors. You can't wait days for a corporate payment. And who serves those markets is another significant area where financial institutions used to drive this process, but you can be certain that that can be disintermediary for many of the contingents within this player. people with unbanked accounts. One of the markets we talked about, for instance, is on immigrants coming and wanting to send money home. Well, that's not exactly a market for opening new bank accounts, right? So there's kind of a democratization of how this whole process can go, and that's one of the things that's driving volumes up on this sector.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting in between, right? Like I said, the extremes are the P2P and the B2B. What's really interesting in today's world is that middle section as well, right? That 12% where we're talking B2C and C2B. And I think that's where we're seeing a lot of different opportunity. And I think it's also in those sectors where you're seeing more and more of, the need for embedded payments, right? Inside of the use cases, right? So everything we've talked about has been, users going out to their bank and doing a transaction, or going out to a third-party application and doing a transaction. But I think during COVID, with the digitization advances that occurred, right, you're now seeing this heavy focus on users really want to be able to do transactions where it is that they're conducting business. What does that mean? Right. If you're talking about a consumer in a banking application, I think, we've already seen that, a consumer is more likely to do a transaction wherever they receive their payroll, where they bank, because it's easier and it's right at their fingertips. So it's easy to look and see, hey, I just got paid on my app, and hey, I want to go ahead and send money. So boy, wouldn't it be great if you had an opportunity just to be able to send money, a consumer remittance, right out of your banking app. The same could apply for businesses as well, using their mobile apps. And then the same thing for corporations, right? It's the ability to embed, think of refund payments for certain types of passenger solutions. You can embed those types of services now inside of the applications of the company. And when consumers do a refund, right, the consumer can actually come in, get an email that their refund is ready, and then go ahead and submit that payment through the instructions that they provide. It's bringing the services to where the consumer is transacting, whether personally or with corporations. A lot of challenges that come with that, but definitely some great opportunities.
What's really interesting too is how you have to parse the market, right? When you look at, just to go with the B2B side, you have conglomerates, you have big corporations, and you have proprietors who have the need to go cross-border with payments. So it can't just be addressed as, yeah, we do General Motors really well, right? It's got to be mainstream businesses also, and it's got to be proprietorships that have an interest in doing this. That's just on the B2B side. On the consumer side, it's very different too, because there's use cases where the volumes are high. So, for instance, sending money home is a big sector. Transacting abroad is a big sector. But it goes back to the whole thing about needing the irrefutability and the efficiency and the effectiveness of making all the moving parts harmonized.
Well, it's interesting when we look at the market. I think the question is, how do the markets today really think about the cross-border solutions that they have? And it's interesting when we look at some of the studies, right? We've seen that really 75% of businesses are unsatisfied with their current cross-border payment options. But the interesting thing is, it's a key part of their business, right? These companies that are not happy with the services, are not getting the efficiencies they need out of their services, they need them in their business. It's core to what they do. And then beyond that, it's another really interesting fact that we've seen, and we experienced this in our own program as well. You were talking about with the cruise lines. There's inherent value to a consumer of having an embedded solution where they want to conduct business, because it's easier. There's less friction of having to provide your payment details somewhere else. And it's just much simpler. And as such, you can actually gain and have a consumer pay a little bit more for that extra service by embedding that service where you conduct business, right? So I think that's a really interesting fact as well.
It's a very purposeful transaction. It's just not like making an impulse purchase on the internet. You're doing a transaction to get something done in a complex environment. So the price sensitivity is not as much as it would be if it was a commoditized transaction. It's a block and tackle credit card payment in Atlanta, Georgia. there's a purpose to this transaction, and that's to move money effectively. It's a very purposeful transaction to move money in a complex environment and have it processed in an effective manner.
It's a great call out, Brian. And I mentioned earlier, right, at Brightwell, our number one core value is users first. And you're kind of speaking to that, right, with what you just said, because in the end, it's understanding no matter what the use case is, what does the user really want and need? And that is how you build solutions that are accepted in the market and create great user experiences. And, so it's interesting, which prompts the question of, why is the world the way that it is today with, users still having to go out to third-party services or going to the back office inside of a bank? Why aren't those solutions embedded where users can transact in a much easier way? And that really leads us to having a discussion around there are some challenges, right? It sounds great and that there's a great opportunity. We see that opportunity, but there are several hurdles that need to be crossed in order to be able to do and provide a great service cross borders, because honestly, it's much more complex, right? In the US, for instance, you can pretty simply now move money quickly, near real time. We've got FedNow coming out. You've seen Zelle embedded into banking apps. So it's very simple to do that. But there are a lot more challenges when you're talking about needing to be able to send money to over 200 different countries. And like you said, the use cases vary, the dollar amounts vary, the entities vary. So there's a lot of complexities in multiple parts of the transaction.
Hal, what are the current challenges the cross-border industry is facing?
It's interesting, as I was mentioning just a minute ago, is that there are complexities. Why aren't these solutions already embedded? And the answer is that there are multiple challenges that need to be overcome. One is compliance with varying regulations, right? You are moving money from one country to another country. Every country has its own regulations. Here in the United States, we have multiple regulations pertaining to doing remittances and cross-border services. We have federal regulations through Reg E and with CFPB with the remittance transfer rule that need to be followed. We've got Dodd-Frank. We have money transfer rules in individual states. So there's a lot of compliance regulations that need to be dealt with. Those are challenging for somebody who is trying to offer a service for the first time to do cross-border services. Additionally, what we've learned as well in our 10 years is there isn't a single connection point where you can just access and send payments everywhere in the world. The reality is you have to build a network of multiple providers to get the best of the best and get the most speed and transparency into the transactions. And that's very time consuming. It's very expensive to do that. The macroeconomic trends in the world are different. Different countries and corridors are at different points in the evolution of doing payments. For instance, in the Philippines, cash is still very much king. We're definitely seeing a shift to digital in the Philippines, but cash is still king. Same in Mexico and in other Latin America countries. When we look at other corridors, Southeast Asia, right, wallets are still really big. We talk about WeChat, Alipay, Philippines, Gcash. Those rails are separate rails. Then we talk about bank account rails. And again, there's a lot of different options on where to connect, but the reality of it is that it takes multiple connections to build a solid network. And that's very expensive and time consuming for a bank or a program manager that's running a DDA solution in the market, or for a corporation to do that. Further beyond that, there's the fraud risk. We experience this as well when you're dealing with a lot of underbanked users who may not be as financially literate in the world. They become prey a lot of times to the fraudsters, right? And so phishing attacks trying to take over their account. So, you really need to have a very sound fraud program fraud prevention and risk management around any cross-border that's out there. And then frankly, the complexities of actually doing an integration. So I talked about needing multiple connections to build a global network. Finding the right people who've got the experience to build the connections is one thing. Then from experience, we've learned it can take 6-7 months to integrate into a single provider, which again, now all of a sudden you're saying, well, great, this was a great idea. There's this great opportunity, but the expense and the effort and the impact on an organization to build something like that yourself is extremely big. And then once you build it, you've got to support it, right? There's got to be support for the transactions. There's got to be the regulatory changes in the data elements as the transactions move. It's all highly complex. So it's all of these challenges, I think, that have prevented, right, from the transactions of getting embedded more in the space.
Well, that's really the big story here, Hal. What do you think about it? It's not just like sending your kid at college $100 to drop in their account. You're moving from jurisdiction to jurisdiction with a level of complexity on one side that doesn't necessarily map to the level of complexity on the other side. In the US, you have a highly penetrated bank market, as an example. Pick a country in developing world, right, where you don't have that penetration of financial inclusion. And how do you move that effectively? You're just not going to drop it into an account from bank A to bank B. It's got to move across the world or move across a border. It's got to be subjected to the originating site's legal constraints, the receiving site's receiving constraints, and making this whole work. There's a level of magic involved, right? That's having the infrastructure to do it. That's reliable on both sides. That's the ability to make it all work. That also drives the process.
Absolutely, right. And that's what we saw. And during COVID, it was interesting for us. You mentioned earlier, right? We spent 10 years working in the cruise business and still do in a very large way. But we looked during COVID and we saw this opportunity in the world, that there was a need for somebody to be able to build a solution, a technology platform, that could connect all of these parties together, right? So you have program managers, fintechs, you have banks that have a need to provide these services and want to do embedded services. You also have corporations that want to embed these services into their marketplaces, into their processes. But these challenges that we were just talking about, right, have prevented them from moving forward. So when we closely looked at Brightwell, at who we are at our core, right, we realized that we are very unique in the fact that we have so much cross-border payments expertise built into our core, into our blood. And we really saw the opportunity to build a platform that we now call ReadyRemit, that enables consumers and corporations to be able to send money through our network of regulated entities and sponsor banks around the world. And we've hooked up those regulated entities with all of those different rails connected through the ReadyRemit platform, so that now we've literally made it possible for people to integrate into one platform, ReadyRemit, and they can do that in a matter of weeks or a month or so. And the service that's going to be provided is a compliant service. It's got the global connectivity that you need. We understand the fraud. We help you work around the fraud, and we empower you to be able to now to embed the service where the users want to send the transactions. That's really the core of what we've built.
I think that sums it up nicely, and certainly cross-border payments are within Brightwell's DNA.
Hal, you spoke a lot about Brightwell and ReadyRemit offering businesses, who are hoping to capitalize on cross-border payments. How should companies looking into this get started?
We'd love to speak to you. Feel free to reach out to myself or to Brightwell. My name's Hal Ramakers, and my email address is hramakers@brightwell.com. And we'll be happy to have a discussion with you and listen to what your needs are, so we can talk about your specific solution that will work for you. Brian, it's been great talking to you, and I hope that we get a chance to talk some more. I'm sure our paths will cross again soon. And I really enjoyed this conversation today.
Hal and Brian, thank you so much for your insights and perspective. As a reminder, the video from today's discussion will be shared by email following today's conversation.